Well, we've made it to the end of the story. What do you think's going to happen? Does Anne get her man? Does Mr. Elliot get his just desserts? Will Mrs. Clay get exposed? Does Louisa fully recover? Jane Austen rewrote these chapters in the last year of her life because she thought the original was flat and tame. And I think she did a good job in the rewrite. What you have to wonder is, if she had stayed alive longer, would she have rewritten them again? Since she did like to rewrite her books a lot. It usually took her, 10 years before she finally wrote a book to the point where she was willing to put it out there for others to get to read. Now, these chapters continue the day that Anne saw Mrs. Smith and got the shocking information about Mr. Elliot. Anne is going to see Lady Russell the next day to tell her everything she knows. Anne was hoping by visiting Mrs. Smith that morning that she would miss out on Mr. Elliot's morning visit to Camden Place. And lucky for her, she did. But he's coming to dinner that night. Apparently, Elizabeth didn't want to offer him an invitation for dinner, but he complained so much about how he missed Sir Walter that morning. And so Elizabeth, knowing how much they like each other's company, she felt obligated to offer him a dinner invitation. We learn a little bit more about Elizabeth's thoughts on Mr. Elliot. She says she doesn't understand his intentions because his interest seems to go a little overboard, but she tolerates him because her dad likes him and, he's like the heir. At dinner that night, Anne found it painful to be around Mr. Elliot. She used to think he might be a little sincere at times, but everything he said and did that night just screamed of insincerity. But she doesn't want to show that she's cooled her feelings towards him. Mr. Elliot wanted Anne to continue her interrogation of who told him of her, but she wouldn't. And he doesn't get it. But we do. Oh, yay! Mr. Elliot is leaving Bath the next morning for almost 2 days. Thinking of Mrs. Clay and her deception, Anne is angry for how her father and sister are being treated by both. However, she thinks Clay's deception is less offensive than Mr. Elliot's. She would even help her father marry Mrs. Clay to thwart Mr. Elliot. The next morning, Anne wanted to go to Lady Russell's to tell her about Mr. Elliot, but Mrs. Clay was getting ready to leave to run some errands for Elizabeth, so Anne wanted to wait until Mrs. Clay left because she didn't want to go walking with Mrs. Clay. Finally, Mrs. Clay left, and just as Anne was ready to leave, there was a knock at the door. Luckily, it wasn't Mr. Elliot. It was Mary and Charles. Anne was very happy to see them. Sir Walter and Elizabeth, they pretended to be happy to see them until they found out that Mary and Charles were staying with the Musgroves, whom they traveled with, rather than stay there. Then, suddenly, they were quite happy to see Mary. We learned through Charles that Louisa and Henrietta's weddings are coming soon. Charles Hayter got a job in a church that gives him enough money to support a wife, so Charles and Henrietta can finally get married. Austen is wrapping up the subplots with little bows for us. How nice. Anne asked Charles if Louisa has completely recovered. He says she has, but she's not the same. There's no more running or jumping, laughing or dancing. She startles easily, and Captain Benwick is always by her side to calm her when this happens. Though that little bit of information about Louisa isn't great, Anne concludes that things at Lepercross are pretty good. As the visit with Mary and Charles nears an end, Elizabeth is torn because she feels like she has to invite the Musgroves to dinner, but if she does, they're going to see how much they've fallen financially, and she really can't handle that. She can't bring herself to make the offer because she doesn't want the Musgroves to be able to look down on them. So she gets this idea that she could offer dinner for a different night, and then she has time to make up the house and make it look nice and better than the Musgroves. Anne decides to go visit the Musgroves in their party rather than see Lady Russell. She can see Lady Russell tomorrow. After all, Mr. Elliot's out of town and she has time now. After about a half hour at the Musgroves, Charles came in with Captain Wentworth. Anne was surprised to see him, but then she thinks, since they're both good friends of the Musgroves, it shouldn't really be a surprise that they would find themselves together. This is the first time seeing each other since the concert where Anne became convinced that Captain Wentworth still loved her. She tries to calm herself around him, but at times she finds it really difficult. Mary's looking out the window and she thinks she sees Mrs. Clay. And she says Clay is talking to someone whom Mary thinks is Mr. Elliot. She begs Anne to come and confirm this, but Anne refuses because Mr. Elliot's out of town, and she doesn't want Captain Wentworth to think anything about her and Mr. Elliot. But eventually, Mary convinces Anne to look, and Anne finds that indeed it is Mr. Elliot. She again doesn't want Captain Wentworth to get the wrong impression, so she calmly and disinterestedly says that, well, he either delayed his trip or she was mistaken about his plans. Charles announces that he's gotten tickets for all of them to go to the theater for a play. He seems really proud of himself. Mary is quite upset because, of course, the night he picked is the night they're supposed to go to her father's for dinner. And Charles teases her about not going and says she can go to her dad's. The rest are going to go to the play. Anne says she would really rather go to the play than the dinner, but she feels like she has to go to the dinner. And then Mrs. Musgrove tells Charles to change the day that they go to the play because it would really be bad if Anne couldn't come with them. Wow, Mary must be in a really good mood because she's not upset at all that they care more about missing Anne than anything about her. Captain Wentworth walked to the fireplace and had a short conversation with Anne about dinner parties. Captain Wentworth remembers she didn't used to like to play cards, but she might have changed over the years. Anne said she had not changed that much, but then stopped herself because she was concerned that he might misinterpret that. Then Sir Walter and Miss Elliot stopped by to extend invitations for dinner for the following night. Much to Anne's surprise, Elizabeth personally gave Captain Wentworth an invitation. She thinks Elizabeth understood that Captain Wentworth was considered an important person around town, and so she had to offer him an invitation. Then they left. Captain Wentworth held the card for a while, contemplating on what to do. Then the men went off to do their thing, and the ladies went off to do their thing. Anne decided to leave, but promised to return the next morning. She is exhausted from trying to stay calm around Captain Wentworth. Back at Camden Place, Anne mentioned to Mrs. Clay that she saw her talking to Mr. Elliot. Clay pretends to have forgotten about this conversation. She said that she was so busy thinking about the dinner party that it just kind of slipped her mind that she ran into him. It's the next morning now, only a day since Anne's conversation with Mrs. Smith. And once again, she has to put off her conversation with Lady Russell because she had promised to spend the day with the Musgroves. With this, we get this really great line from Austen that Anne is busy, so Mr. Elliot's character, like the Sultaness Scheherazade's head, must live another day. I really love Austen's humor. That morning, it was raining, so she was late getting to the Musgroves. By the time she got there, Mrs. Croft, Captain Harville, and Captain Wentworth were already there. She had expected a nice, calm day with friends, but with Captain Wentworth there, she really can't relax. Captains Wentworth and Harville were writing a letter, and Mrs. Musgrove and Mrs. Croft were discussing the engagement between Henrietta and Charles Hayter. The ladies were sort of whisper-talking, and Anne felt like she shouldn't be in the conversation. But Captain Harville was the only person available for her to talk to, and he was giving off these vibes like he didn't really want to talk, so she was forced to sit there and listen to the conversation. At some point in the conversation, the ladies talked about how short engagements are better than long engagements, especially when there is no certainty of an actual marriage date. This caused Anne and Captain Wentworth to look at each other in recognition of their own engagement date and the uncertainty they had with their wedding date because they didn't know when Captain Wentworth would get the money needed for him to marry Anne. Anne is saved from this uncomfortable conversation because Captain Harville finally feels like talking. He showed her a small painting of Captain Benwick that was originally commissioned for Fanny, but now Captain Harville is giving it to Benwick for Louisa. Captain Harville is upset that Benwick seems to have moved on from Fanny so quickly. He said Fanny would never have forgotten Benwick so quickly, and Anne believed that about her, even though they never met. Ultimately, I think Captain Harville can't understand why Benwick isn't spending more time in utter despair at Fanny's loss, and I think the upcoming marriage is a constant reminder of his sister's loss and all the things that she can't experience. Anne explains that women aren't better than men with respect to love, but men have their work and other pursuits to occupy their time to help them get over the lost love, whereas women have a lot of time at home and a lot of time on their hands, and they live in their feelings. Harville points out that Benwick hasn't been required to work or anything, so that doesn't explain him moving on so quickly. Good point. Anne says, okay then, maybe it's just part of man's nature. Oh, Captain Harville very much disagrees with that, because he thinks men are stronger and therefore more capable of handling the pain of lost love. Anne thinks,
Sure, Jan.
No, seriously, she agrees men are more robust, but strength isn't the same thing as endurance. Men have lots on their plates, always laboring or toiling, exposed to every risk and hardship. Their time, health, and life are not really their own, which is why men don't live as long as women. So to add loving more on top of that would be just too much for men. Anne and Captain Harville's conversation is interrupted when Captain Wentworth drops his pen. Anne is wondering, is he listening to this conversation? Harville continues to argue for men by pointing out that there is plenty of proof of men's depth and love in books, poetry, and music. Then he brushes off Anne's argument before she's even able to make it. He says, you'll just say these were written by men. Anne's like, well, of course. You guys have the education. You write the books, poetry and music. You have all the advantage of telling your story. Harville then wonders, well, how can they prove anything? And Anne astutely says, you can't. After all, this is only opinion. We start with our biases of our own sex, and then we look for proof that supports our own biases. Captain Harville says he wishes that he could get Anne to understand how men feel when they have to leave their families for the sea and not knowing if they'll ever see their families again. But Anne says she doesn't mean to diminish men's feelings and that she believes men are equal in all aspects of love. Equal, that is, as long as your love is with you. For women, they love past the point where their love is with them, even when all hope of love is lost. At this point, Anne tells us she couldn't speak anymore because she is so overtaken by emotions, and she's starting to breathe heavily, probably in part because Captain Wentworth is so close and probably hears everything she's saying. If Captain Wentworth heard what she said, do you think he picked up on her saying she still loves him? Luckily for Anne, Captain Harville accepted her argument, so they didn't have to continue the conversation. Also, it was time for Mrs. Croft to leave, but she took a minute to tell Anne that she would see Anne at her father's party later in the evening and asked Captain Wentworth to confirm he was going. But Captain Wentworth was so focused on folding the letter he was writing, he really didn't pay any attention to Mrs. Croft. Once Captain Wentworth finished folding the letter, he, Mrs. Croft, and Captain Harville left. Captain Harville said bye to Anne, but Captain Wentworth said nothing to her and just walked past, not even looking at her. She wasn't quite sure what to make of this, but I think she was startled a little bit. Anne walked to the table where Captain Wentworth was writing the letter when Captain Wentworth returned the room because, supposedly, he left his gloves. He met her at the writing table where he pulled a letter from under some scattered papers on the table and handed it to her. He gave her this look. It was short, but it was directly in her eyes, and it said, "Read this, please." Then he took his gloves and he left. The letter was addressed to Miss A.E. It looked to be a letter he was folding so hastily when Mrs. Croft was ready to leave. It turned out he was writing her a letter as well as one to Captain Benwick. Mrs. Musgrove was busy, and Anne was really hoping that she would stay busy long enough for Anne to read the letter. According to Austen, her eyes devoured the following words. "I can listen no longer in silence. I must speak to you by such means as are within my reach. You pierce my soul. I am half agony, half hope. Tell me not that I am too late, that such precious feelings are gone forever. I offer myself to you again with a heart even more your own than when you almost broke it, 8 years and a half ago. Dare not say that man forgets sooner than woman, that his love has an earlier death." Okay, so he was listening. "I have loved none but you. Unjust I may have been, weak and resentful I have been, but never inconstant. You alone have brought me to Bath. For you alone I think and plan. Have you not seen this? Can you fail to have understood my wishes? I had not waited even these 10 days could I have read your feelings, as I think you must have penetrated mine. I can hardly write. I am every instant hearing something which overpowers me. You sink in your voice, but I can distinguish the tones of that voice when they would be lost on others. Too good, too excellent creature. You do us justice indeed. You do believe that there is true attachment and constancy among men. Believe it to be the most fervent, most undeviating in F.W. I must go, uncertain of my fate. But I shall return hither, or follow your party, as soon as possible. A word, a look, will be enough to decide whether I enter your father's house this evening or never. Holy moly. Before she could recover from Captain Wentworth's words, Charles, Mary, and Henrietta all came in. She was so shaken from the letter that she wasn't able to collect herself, so her only option was to go home where she could fully deal with the letter. Charles Musgrove insisted on walking her home, which Anne saw as almost cruel because she really, really needed to be alone right now. Thank goodness, for Anne, they ran into Captain Wentworth on the walk. At first the three walked together, but as fate would have it, Charles had needed to see some guy about a gun, and so he asked Captain Wentworth to walk Anne home. Once they couldn't see Charles anymore, they turned off onto a gravel road where they could have some privacy and talk. They started talking about their past and worked their way to the present day. They were so engrossed in their conversation that they didn't pay attention to anybody who passed them. Captain Wentworth confirmed his jealousy of Mr. Elliot, and that his belief of their relationship was the reason he was so hot and cold around her, especially at the concert and the previous 24 hours. He said that what she said to Captain Harville made him grab a piece of paper and pour out his feelings for her. He tried to get over her, and he thought at one point he had, but then he ran into her at Uppercross and realized that really all he was bitterly angry for her dumping him. Because of that anger and pride, he flirted with Louisa, but he had no intention of marrying her. What happened at Lyme made him realize Anne's steadiness and gentleness, and made him think that they had a second chance. But by then, everybody had seemed to think that he and Louisa were an item, and practically engaged. And at that point, he realized that he wasn't free to pursue her. He had obligated himself to Louisa because he wasn't careful with her. That's why he left for Kellynch Hall for a while, in part to figure out what to do, and I think in part hoping that the distance between him and Louisa would change her feelings for him. He was relieved to find out that Louisa and Captain Benwick had gotten together, and now he thought he could come to Bath and win her back. However, he was stopped by Mr. Elliot. He believed that all her friends and family wanted her to marry him, and they could persuade her to marry Mr. Elliot over him. Anne, as only Anne can do, gently reminds him that she yielded to persuasion when she was younger because she thought it was her duty to listen to others. But as she's gotten older and more mature, and she trusts her own judgment more than anything. Conveniently, they've made their way to Camden Place once they finished reminiscing and had all the confusion cleared up. Anne was happy as a clam, and I can imagine that she floated into the house that day. Now the story jumps to the party later that evening. It's described as too numerous for intimacy and too small for variety. Anne is a good hostess. She wanted so much to just spend her time with Captain Wentworth, but Anne is a good hostess, so she mingled with everyone. All they had were short conversations. During one of these short conversations, Anne tells Captain Wentworth that she's been thinking about their past, and though she thinks that Lady Russell's advice was bad, she was right to follow it. She believed that the suffering she would have endured from an unstable engagement and marriage would have been worse than the suffering from the last 8 years. Captain Wentworth wasn't quite so gracious toward Lady Russell, but thought that in time he could forgive her. He also said he'd been thinking about the past and realized that some of the suffering was his own making because he could have written to her when he came into the money. But his pride kept him from doing so. If he had, it could have spared them 6 years. Now that these two lovebirds have decided to marry, they have to tell everyone. With Captain Wentworth having money and good standing in society, they aren't as concerned about what people might say about their union. First up, Daddy. Sir Walter made no objection. In fact, Captain Wentworth is handsome, so he's okay with the marriage. Elizabeth, no objections. She only really cares about rank, and Captain Wentworth has that. Mary, she's happy for Anne. She thinks she had some part in getting them together because she kept Anne at Uppercross for so long. And also, She can look down on Anne and Captain Wentworth because they're not landed gentry like she is. Lady Russell is the only person that makes Anne nervous. Lady Russell had to deal with the fact that she was wrong about Captain Wentworth and Mr. Elliot. She wasn't as good at assessing people's worthiness as she thought she was. But she loved Anne, and Anne's happiness was her only desire, so she was happy to accept Captain Wentworth. Mr. Elliot. What a surprise Anne's engagement was to him. But he was not to be foiled in keeping Sir Walter unmarried. We know his plan was to insinuate himself in Sir Walter's life at every turn to keep Mrs. Clay from getting her claws on him. What we didn't know was that he had a plan B. Make Mrs. Clay fall for him, which is what she did. And after the news about Anne, the two of them ran off together. He was going to remain Sir Walter's heir, no matter what. Of course, I'm sure Mrs. Clay finds marrying Mr. Elliot at least slightly better than Sir Walter since, they're closer in age. Elizabeth was not happy that her friend ran off and that she and Mr. Elliot were playing them. Of course, the real cause of hers and Sir Walter's unhappiness at Clay leaving is there isn't anyone to sit around and tell them how wonderful they are. Lastly, Mrs. Smith. She was their first visitor when they settled into their new life, and Captain Wentworth helped her recover her husband's property. In addition to her improved income, her health started to improve as well, and she and Anne's friendship grew deeper. Anne was happy to be a sailor's wife, but she knew that war could take him away at any time. Other than that, Anne and Captain Wentworth lived happily ever after.